Hello, I'm Stuart Pallister, the editor of INSEAD Knowledge, and today we're at the Singapore headquarters of the Banyan Tree to talk to Ho Kwon Ping, Executive Chairman of the Luxury Hotel Group, about the company's branding and marketing strategies. Looking back at setting up the company and so on, came about around 94. Within a very short space of time, something like 5 years, you became a leading Asian brand. Was that purely driven by the idea of the Banyan Tree experience, or was it part marketing expertise? How did you manage to do that so quickly?
We perhaps managed to do it so quickly because we had said at the very beginning that if we didn't do it quickly, we would die quickly. And I've said to quite a number of audiences, and it perhaps is particularly relevant in the Asian context, because so many Asian companies during the whole boom years have risen to prosperity on the basis of being contract manufacturers or OEM manufacturing. And the difference between us and some others is that for many other companies, having a strong brand is a reward for your being successful in many things that you do, but it's sort of coincidental. It comes afterwards. It's a reward for success in other areas. For us, we've always said from the very beginning, having a strong brand is imperative for our survival. And the whole story of Banyan Tree really is a story of how I, as a business person, not knowing anything really about the hotel industry, but of course loving the romance of travel with my wife and so on, but that doesn't justify or qualify you to become a hotelier. And I was a business person who had been called back from journalism to manage our family business, which was really like a small microcosm of typical overseas Chinese business. Jack of all trades, but not dominant in any particular area. We had so many contract manufacturing companies. We did we assembled television sets for Samsung or LG. We did white goods like consumer appliances. We even invested in a shoe factory for Nike, Adidas, and so on. And my epiphany was when I set up a shoe factory in Thailand and had to close it within 1 year because somebody else got cheaper, Indonesia got cheaper. Then I had this real wake-up call that if you are to rely all the time on being cost competitive alone, either you better grow bigger and bigger than everybody else, or somebody else will eat you up and somebody else will become more competitive. And that's really the big problem and dilemma today for all contract manufacturers. Scale and cost is everything. So I decided I didn't want to run that race. And if you don't run that race and you analyze life objectively, there are only two advantages in life which are proprietary rather than relative. Technology, if you create the technology, you own it. And branding, if you create a brand, you own that brand. And since I'm not a technologist, I decided that whatever business I was going to do next had to have a strong brand. After having determined this, going into the hotel business was finding a vehicle. But Banyan Tree is all about creating a brand. And that's why even today, we are beginning to grow beyond being a hotel company. Our spas are quite well known. We've gone into Banyan Tree Private Collection. We're going into Banyan Tree Residences and into an area that is more perhaps property development than pure hotel keeping. And the whole story of Banyan Tree, to the extent that it has any relevance to people who are not in the hotel business, is that in today's global world, particularly for Asian companies, you really have to have a strong brand. You have to own your customer and not just own the manufacturing process.
So how do you move now from being an Asian brand to a global one? Is it a different process, or is it an extension of what you've been doing up to now?
I think it is an extension, but with calibrations along the way. The big challenge will be one of scale. For a relatively small regional company, even though we're listed, to be a global company runs the risk of organizational diffusion, lack of clarity, lack of cohesion in decision making, runs a danger of the brand being diluted. So I think the big challenge, as I see it, is to maintain cohesiveness in structure, in brand identity, in service standards, as we now are moving onto a global scale.
Why do you think it is that not that many Asian companies have become global brands? I mean, you can count them on one hand, maybe Singapore Airlines, Sony, Samsung.
I think there's quite a lot of Asian companies that have become global brands, but not at our scale. Because as you say, Singapore Airlines is much larger. Sony, Samsung, largely speaking, the only companies besides Singapore Airlines and a few others that have become global brands in the consumer field have been quasi-monopolies. Either they are the Zaibatsus in Japan or the Chaebos in Korea. So scale was absolutely necessary for them. I think our proposition is that in a globalized world, it is possible to not be a multi-billion-dollar company and still try to achieve global branding. One of the people that my wife and I knew and admired very much was Anita Roddick, who unfortunately just died very tragically. But she's a phenomenon of someone who created, way ahead of her time, a global brand without at all having the financial scale that you would think was necessary. I think what she brought to bear that allowed her to do this was no doubt her creativity, her sense of timing, but very importantly is a connection with your market. One of the reasons why Asian companies have not been able to create brands is because the consumer market has largely been Western. And it's very difficult for an Asian, maybe it's easier for me because I think my own upbringing is such that I straddle both worlds quite comfortably. But it's not that easy for an Asian to be in Anita Roddick's shoes and understand how the UK market was moving, how the whole baby boom generation was beginning to, there was this inchoate readiness to embrace the values that she brought into Body Shop. But the people were there. She just led the way, but she understood that market. Now, the ball game has changed. It's now, I think the 21st century is really going to be the age of Asia, both India and China. The huge consumer markets are going to be Asian, whether Indian, Chinese, or rainbow color. Now there's a real opportunity for people of Asian origin who have an instinctive cultural feel for where their consumers are moving towards to come out and create a brand which can be primarily perhaps rooted in their own Asian context but have a global relevance.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Body Shop and Anita Roddick because you seem to have embraced social responsibility and the principles of social responsibility quite early in the game.
I guess why my wife and I hit it off with Anita Roddick so well is because we're people of the same generation. She's about 10 years older. We're in our 50s, she was in her 60s, but we're that same baby boom generation, the Vietnam War generation, the whole generation that wore its ideals on its sleeves and, the Woodstock generation, etc. So we grew up in an environment where those very same core beliefs of social justice, equality, economic development for the third world and so on were the key values in our lives. And I was a journalist writing about economic development, not high finance. My wife was a sociologist doing her thesis on electronics workers in Hong Kong. And one of my goals at that time had been to join the United Nations or some other such agency. So we were very much into developmental things already. So in a way, Banyan Tree has been a vehicle for us using business as a means to of course, create something that we hope is beautiful and sustainable, but at the same time, using business as a means to enable many of the deep-seated beliefs we have about corporate social responsibility, to enable that to occur within the world. At our time, the word CSR did not exist. Today, it's sort of the buzzword. But in those days, it was social activism or whatever you called it. But the core beliefs are the same. And therefore, what we've been doing regarding the environment, regarding the empowerment of communities and of women and so on, it was more fundamental to us than the notion of building a banyan tree. So there's no way we could possibly lose that.
You mentioned timing earlier as being important. So why do you think the timing is right now to expand aggressively across the world? It's up to now you've focused fairly narrowly on the Asia Pacific.
I think, in fact, maybe perhaps I don't see things as opportunities. I see them more as risks that if we don't do something, we'll be left behind. So I'm always paranoid. And I always love Andy Grove's title of his book. There's a founder of Intel who said his book was titled "Only the Paranoid Survive." I'm paranoid about us not being able to survive into the future. And what I see happening is a truly globalized world. And I see that in other sectors in which I have some relationship with, whether it be aviation or banking or utilities and so on. But particularly, let's say, in the tourism space, with the advent of technologies of all kinds, from the internet, which is enabling all kinds of revolutions in terms of travel, which I won't get into here, other kinds of transport technologies, ultra-large aircraft, low-cost budget carriers. So the combination of technology and other things has truly created opportunities for previously not sustainable business models to become sustainable. Specifically, for players in niches to be global. In the past, I think if you wanted to set up a global chain of hotels which were like us, for various reasons of distribution, the cost of travel and so on, it's not viable. Today it is viable. Somebody is going to do it over the next 5 years and become a global player in the space that I'm playing in. If I don't become one of those global players, I will not survive in the long term. So to me, it's not just one of great opportunities, let's go and build. It's really the imperative is there. The world is changing. If we don't become a global player, we will be left behind. So that's what propels me.
And that was Ho Kwon Ping, Executive Chairman of the Banyan Tree Group, talking about the company's marketing and branding strategies. I'm Stuart Pallister in Singapore.